Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 18th chapter. If another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. If the member listens to you, you have regained that one. But if you are not listened to, take one or two others along with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, truly I tell you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything you ask, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among them. The Gospel of the Lord.
In a few days, my younger brother Rick will have a birthday. He's my only remaining brother since I lost my older brother David about 25 years ago, but Rick and I are estranged. I'm not even sure what happened. It's a very painful thing. I mean, he and his wife moved out of state during COVID days and he just ghosted me. He stopped responding to my texts and my phone calls. He even changed his phone number without letting me know. Even my Facebook posts and messages to him have gone unreplied to. Well, I've reached out to him through his son, my nephew, but there's still no indication that he nor his wife want any sort of relationship with me or others of my family, and I don't really know why. I know my gayness may have been an issue for them since they were part of a rather conservative church, but the truth is, I really don't know that for sure. It may have nothing to do with me at all. Maybe something just shifted in his life or their life. You know, I'll make another attempt on his birthday in a few days, but I hold out very little hope for a renewal of our brotherly love. And I tell you that because I know others in this faith community who also know estrangement from family. And in the case where there is not necessarily estrangement, still plenty of tensions and conflict for a variety of reasons. It's a painful reality for many of us, maybe for all of us, especially when resolution seems impossible. Well, today's gospel lesson ends with Jesus saying, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among them. And the rest of the gospel reading alludes to another reality where 2 or 3 are gathered, it can be really hard to get along. It's important to recognize that conflict, at least to some degree, is part of every human relationship that matters to us. That's just normal. And while we've all known what it is to be in a relationship with conflict, sadly, we know too about relationships we've had that have not been able to survive because of such conflict, because of stubbornness, because of pride or an inability to forgive. All those things can prevent healing and reconciliation to the point where the relationship finally crumbles beneath irreconcilable differences. So what does Jesus have to say about all this? In what direction would he point us as we try to figure out how to deal with those with whom we are at odds? Well, first of all, Jesus says it outright in places other than in our gospel reading for today. In other places of gospel, Jesus says, love all people, even those with whom you are at odds, like your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. Well, so what does it mean to love somebody? Well, you may be happy to hear it doesn't always mean we have to necessarily like them. Although there is a real possibility that if we truly love someone, we just might learn to like that person as well. And that person might just learn to like us too. Loving an enemy means recognizing that they are creatures of God, as are we, and that because they are worthy of God's love, they are also worthy of our love. Since God forgives them, we are also called to forgive them and to pray and work for their welfare. We hold out a hand of kindness and even at times we risk rejection in doing so. Those are godlike qualities. Do you remember Jesus who forgave his enemies from the cross? And the gift of love that he gave to even those who rejected that love? But there are situations, aren't there, like those who have been victims of emotional abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse. What about forgiveness then? Well, forgiveness is healing to the soul of the forgiver as well as the forgiven. In addition to the spiritual benefits, those who live a life of forgiveness have better mental and physical health outcomes. Achieving forgiveness of the abuse is often the pathway for a survivor to rebuild new, healthy relationships with others. However, in the case of relationship violence, premature forgiveness of the abuse through reconciliation can place the abused partner, as well as children and other family members, at greater risk of future harm. Forgiveness is this ongoing process that takes a while, it takes time, and it takes a full recognition of the offense and real grieving of the loss. The process of forgiveness requires courage to face the truth before bitterness can be emotionally released. Also, facing the truth of abuse often means that reconciliation is not possible. Reconciliation is not a requirement of forgiveness. Now, this is a really important distinction. Otherwise, in the church's admonition of always try to reconcile with those who have offended us in such egregious ways, it becomes nothing less than a rewounding and victimizes again the person who was abused. And so forgiveness, even of the abuser, does not imply reconciliation of a relationship. But there are other relationships in which we can work toward reconciliation. Well, what does Jesus say about that? Well, in the gospel lesson today, he says, if someone sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. If that person listens to you, you have gained a friend. In other words, Jesus actually encourages confrontation. Harm cannot simply go unchallenged, but it's done in private so as not to humiliate the other person, and it's done with the intention of getting back into relationship, reconciling with that person, not simply to insult them or berate an enemy. Interesting, isn't it, that the text prescribes a deliberate process of escalation with the ultimate goal of gaining a sister, a brother, or a sibling. Confrontation is a necessary companion on the road of reconciliation. But when the confrontation occurs, it should be done in a way that invites relationship, invites reconciliation. And by the way, we all stand in need of being confronted at times. None of us are perfect. We all stand in need of grace from God and from one another. Well, reconciliation of this sort creates a special kind of unity and a special kind of agreement. As Jesus says in today's reading, I assure you that if two of you agree on earth about anything you ask, then my Father who is in heaven will do it for you. But notice too in the gospel reading when that doesn't work, or it can't work. Suddenly the larger community becomes involved, as it says, if you are not listened to, take one or two others along. If the person refuses to listen to them, then tell it to the church. And what's implied here is that the larger community often has to intervene on behalf of those who aren't listened to. For confrontation is difficult, especially when there's a power differential. For those who have no voice or little chance of confronting those who are hurting them, it's important that we walk alongside them and protect those who are being disempowered or made vulnerable, enabling them to speak so that others might hear. And for some who have no voice, then we might even speak on their behalf. All this, Jesus reminds us, hinges on one important thing: listening. The lesson speaks of listening, that the offender needs to listen to the one who is offended. Listening is hard. 4 times it's mentioned in the first 3 verses of the gospel reading. Jesus makes reference to listening or refusing to listen, saying that it's important to listen to the truth in another. So what kind of a listener are you, especially in matters where someone has a complaint about you or something you've done? Well, if you're like most people, and you probably are, then more than likely we know we don't do so well, especially if someone is calling us out for something. You know, we live in kind of a call-out culture. People are ready at any moment to point the finger at someone else. And what if instead of calling people out, what we did is we called them into a process of reconciliation, that we might be in relationship and not at odds with them. This art of reconciliation is more than personal. It's a matter of community. For just as conflict affects the entire family, so reconciliation is also a communal event. As the church, we are constantly in the business of healing division, bridging gaps that separate one from another, sibling from sibling, black from white, rich from poor, male from female, gay from straight. The entire message of the gospel is about healing relationships that have known brokenness, that have known separation, and the restoration of the once lost connection between God and all of humanity, which to accomplish, we know Christ had to die on a cross. Well, today's Bible reading invites us to look intently into the mirror of the gospel and to reflect its truth in all our relationships. We live in a remarkable moment defined by much conflict and polarization in our culture. It's important that we confront the source of brokenness in our own personal relationships and in our larger communities, and that goes for our faith community too. As we do, will we provide an invitation to reconciliation? Will the truth we speak in love be the means by which we gain a sister, a brother, or a sibling? Or will we use it to drive an even deeper wedge, a wider chasm between ourselves and someone that we've been called to love, even if they have hurt us? In other words, as I point the finger, will I also open a door? I'll finish with a little story. When Leonardo da Vinci was painting The Last Supper, he had this intense, bitter argument with a fellow painter. Leonardo was so enraged that he decided to paint the face of his enemy into the face of Judas, and that way the hated painter's face would be preserved for ages in the face of the betraying disciple. Well, with this addition, his work was completed, except for one last thing. He needed to paint the face of Christ. But as much as he tried, he could not paint the face of Christ. Something was holding him back. Well, Leonardo decided his hatred toward his fellow painter was the very problem. And at last he took his brush and he painted out his companion's portrait. And he then sought out his companion and apologized to him for the attitude he had expressed toward him. He forgave him his wrong. And the story goes that in his dreams that night, Da Vinci saw a splendid vision of the Christ. And the next day he took his brushes and he painted the magnificent picture of the Christ that people have gazed at in awe ever since. Jesus says, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among them. And that goes for when we get along with each other, and it also goes for the times when we bicker and we fight. Regardless, Jesus is present. But let me suggest to you that it is easier to notice the presence of Jesus when we get along with each other than when we don't. For maybe when we gain a friend, it becomes easier to see the face of Christ in that person. And maybe that's exactly what Jesus means when he says, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among them. Amen.